Welcome to session one of our essential series on exile and restoration. This week we are going to begin exploring this topic, and we are looking at some of just kind of the background before we head into the book of Daniel. Give us a little overview of what's going on in our readings today, a little kind of a 10,000 foot overview of the exile.
So our scriptures from Kings and Chronicles, ultimately they're asking a couple of interrelated questions. First is, why does Israel lose their ancestral land? So what is this exile about? And then another kind of related question might be, why did God abandon his people in exile? And the answers that we're going to find out throughout our study is ultimately is disobedience to the worship of Yahweh alone, to God alone. But we find out that it wasn't really abandonment. I think that that's the question that's almost being asked, but I think we realize it's not abandonment, it's the consequences of sin and alienation from their God. We find out that God actually never abandons them. He's with them, even in the midst of exile and their circumstances. So that's going on, but contextually, and I think this is important to think about, geopolitically speaking, if you want to say it that way, Israel's misfortunes also have to do with where they sit between the Assyrians or the Babylonians and Egypt. So there's some massive kingdoms, and they're in the pincers of these power struggles between these kingdoms. And you don't have to think very hard to imagine why that's difficult. You've got your border up here is wanting your fealty and your allegiance, and your border down here wants the same thing from you. You're kind of being pinched. And so these two big bullies on the block, they're rivals. They're looking for control of this land that the Israelites hold. So it doesn't explain why they go into exile, but they exist in a tenuous circumstance, right? It's the circumstances of how they live. This is always around them.
That's helpful context. What gives a little more kind of particular historical background? What's going on exactly with the Israelites at this time?
So the northern and southern kingdoms, Israel and Judah, they've been living in fairly continuous cycles of disobedience to the covenant, to God's covenant, to their worship. Major in kind of that disobedience is pervasive idolatry. We're going to hear about idolatry in weeks to come. Again, they are surrounded by powerful kingdoms who worship other gods. This is going to have an impact. So they fear kind of rival gods and other gods, and they begin to adopt a few pagan customs into their own rites and rituals and worship. I've heard it said, if the worship of Yahweh, this is totally base, by the way, the worship of Yahweh is brownie mix. If you add dog food to the brownie, you've changed it substantially, right? So they've added dog food to the brownie mix by taking these pagan customs and integrating them into what they're doing. So the worship of Baal and Asherah, bowing down to idols, this is all kind of playing into the disobedience, distracting them from who they are as God's people, even so far into entering into some occultic practices, divination, omens. There's even possibly some evidence of human sacrifice. So there's some crazy things that are happening among the people of God in breaking the covenant with Yahweh. Additionally, and we don't get this in our readings so much, but we could get them elsewhere. In addition to the idolatry, there's economic injustice, right? The wealthy are exploiting the poor. They're selling the righteous for silver, trampling on the heads of the needy. So this is, of course, not in accordance with God's covenant. There's corruption at the highest levels in legal and economic systems. There's use of dishonest scales, as it were. So those kind of political and economic factors are also disobedient to God's covenants. And of course, there's nothing new under the sun. Those things have made their way through history, exploitation of the poor, etc.
So that's a helpful background. Now, this obviously happened a long, long time ago. How does this speak to our lives today? What might we talk about in
Right.
terms of application today and moving forward in the study?
Yeah, so as interesting as it may be for them, so what? As I said, there's nothing new under the sun. It does apply to us. Number one, we find that at the outset and continually, they're going to be living in tension within the cultures that they live, not only their own and being surrounded, but when they're in exile in Babylon, how do they dominate the dominant culture around them and still stay true to who they are, their identity as the children of God? Where might we see forgiveness and mercy at work as we're caught in a tension of dominant cultures that may speak against our identity as God's children? This idea of kind of being sojourners or aliens in a place where that's not their home, that certainly applies to us as we're, again, children of God, citizens of heaven, sojourning in a land that may be asking us to compromise some things about who we are. But finally, we're going to see in these stories God's mercies are foundational. He does not abandon his people, and that certainly applies to us, that in the midst of these tensions and conflicts and desires to compromise, that God's mercies uphold us.
Well, those are really important themes and really important questions, not only for the Israelites, but for us today. And I look forward to our conversation and hearing about your conversation in your small groups.